Hey guys, did you know that in Imperial China, your entire future could hinge on a single drop of blood? Or the lack of one? Imagine entering a palace not knowing if you'd become a royal favorite or get tossed out like yesterday's leftovers, all based on a test you didn't even know you were taking. The stakes? Life, death, or endless boredom locked in a silk prison with 300 other desperate women. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. We begin in a palace so large it needed its own zip code, deep in the Forbidden City. The walls were red, the roofs golden, and the air thick with powdered makeup, politics, and paranoia. In this world, being chosen as a concubine wasn't just a gig, it was a gamble, a royal lottery ticket printed on your womb. But before you even got the chance to bat your eyes at the emperor, you had to survive. The virginity test. Sounds glamorous, right? Wrong. Let's break this down. The selection process for imperial concubines, known as the Draft of Beauties, was essentially a high-stakes beauty pageant with more spies than sequins. Teenage girls, sometimes as young as 12, were brought to the capital from all corners of the empire. Their families often saw this as a golden ticket to honor and riches. "Oh look, my daughter is going to the palace," they'd say proudly. Meanwhile, their daughter is being examined like cattle at a livestock fair. The physical exam was brutal. No makeup, no jewelry, no padding. Just your raw face and body scrutinized under the critical eye of a panel of elderly court women and eunuchs whose main hobby was judging teenagers for a living. They checked for posture, symmetry, teeth, skin, breath, even the scent of your sweat. Yes, body odor could be the reason you were sent packing. Not imperial enough, not fresh enough, not worth the emperor's time. And then came the test. In the more conservative periods of Imperial China, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties, the state was obsessed with chastity. Virginity wasn't just a virtue, it was practically currency. A girl's hymen was seen as physical proof of her moral worth. Lose it, and you lost everything, in theory anyway. The virginity test was usually conducted in secrecy, inside a heavily guarded chamber known ominously as the inspection room. Sounds fun already. A female physician, often under the supervision of a senior eunuch, would perform a manual examination. Yes, that's a polite term for invasive procedures that wouldn't pass any modern consent laws. The girl was stripped of her layers of silk, and trembling not from the cold, but from the knowledge that a single slip-up could doom her entire bloodline to shame. The examiners looked for signs of an intact hymen, even though, surprise, science tells us that hymens aren't exactly reliable indicators. Horseback riding, climbing trees, or even a bad cough could damage it. But did that matter? Nope. In the eyes of the court, your entire honor lived in one tiny, misunderstood membrane. If the inspectors found what they were looking for, you passed. Congratulations, you're now eligible to be locked away for years, forbidden from speaking to your family, and possibly picked to warm the emperor's bed once every 3 months. If you failed, goodbye. No ceremony, no second chances. Just a quiet exit back to obscurity, or worse, into the hands of a furious family now burdened with a disgraced daughter. And don't even think about faking it. You see, the stakes were so high that some ambitious families did try to outsmart the system. False hymens, thin membranes made of animal skin or silk soaked in blood, were smuggled into the palace, tucked away between legs and prayers. There are even recorded cases of girls using plant-based mixtures that mimicked bleeding. But the court was wise to these tricks. Eunuchs, with their unmatched experience in human deceit, were trained to sniff out fraud like bloodhounds. And when a forgery was discovered, the girl didn't just get sent home. She could be whipped, jailed, or even executed for attempting to deceive the emperor. All of this just for the possibility of becoming one of the emperor's dozens, sometimes hundreds, of women. Let's not forget, you weren't even guaranteed a night with His Majesty. You might sit untouched in your golden cage forever, aging out like sour milk on the emperor's shelf. Some concubines lived out their days in silent desperation, waiting for a summons that never came. Others got one glorious night and then spent the rest of their lives embroidering slippers and writing bitter poetry. And here's the kicker. Even if you passed the virginity test and got pregnant, thinking you'd secured your golden ticket, there was no guarantee you'd survive. Rival concubines poisoned each other with alarming creativity. Favorite dishes laced with mercury, face creams hiding arsenic, or just a good old-fashioned shove down the stairs. Imperial China wasn't just a royal court, it was a full-blown Game of Thrones episode, minus the dragons, but with more embroidery. So why, you ask, was the virginity test so important? The answer lies in one word: lineage. The emperor's children were more than just kids. They were future rulers, political tools, and living gods. Ensuring their purity meant ensuring that the dynasty's bloodline remained untainted by the great horror of all horrors: illegitimacy. If a concubine had already been with someone else, there was always the terrifying possibility that the baby she carried wasn't the emperor's. And in a system where heritage determined who lived in palaces and who got beheaded, that simply wasn't a risk anyone was willing to take. Add to that a toxic cocktail of Confucian virtue, state ideology, and extreme patriarchy, and you get a society where a woman's virginity became state property. And this was all institutionalized, mind you. There were actual government officials whose entire job was monitoring the sexual status of royal women. Imagine filling that out on a resume: Imperial Inspector of Hymenal Integrity. I mean, what do your colleagues call you at lunch? But it gets worse. Even after passing the test and surviving the first few weeks in the palace, your virginity continued to haunt you. If you somehow failed to please the emperor, maybe you weren't charming enough, maybe you blinked wrong during tea service, you could be demoted, exiled, or worse. Some concubines were forced to retire early, sent to nunneries where they shaved their heads and lived out their days in silence, praying for a peace that never really came. Others were assigned to palace duties like textile inspection or incense preparation, from potential queen mother to glorified room freshener in 6 months or less. And if you think the emperor had it better, not really. He was expected to maintain this massive harem, balancing his time, energy, and fertility like a bureaucratic Casanova. There were schedules, spreadsheets, entire logs maintained by eunuchs about who he slept with and when. Sex wasn't intimacy, it was administration. Still feeling nostalgic for Imperial China? Didn't think so. Yet despite all this madness, many young girls and their families wanted this life. The possibility, however slim, of bearing the next emperor was like a shimmering oasis on the horizon. And hope, as we know, is the cruelest drug of all. So next time someone romanticizes ancient dynasties and royal courts, remember, behind every gold-trimmed robe was a girl who bled not just for love, but for survival. And she didn't even get to keep the robe. Winter winds clawed through the palace corridors, carrying whispers of silk rustling and eunuchs scurrying like nervous rats. For those still standing after the virginity test, life in the inner court was a precarious balancing act between fascination and fear. Imagine being handed a golden tray of steamed buns, only to discover one is laced with arsenic. That was concubine life, a constant feast of anxiety. In these gilded cages, every smile was a calculation. The moment your name appeared on the day's roster, posted at the Hall of Ceremonies, you donned your finest silks, painted your cheeks in vermilion, and rehearsed your curtsies until your spine ached. The emperor's scheduled visits felt more like dentist appointments. You knew they were coming, you couldn't avoid them, and you hoped he'd leave quickly. Food delivery was another imperial nightmare. When dinner arrived, it wasn't just a matter of taste, but a test. Did you trust the eunuch who brought it? Some concubines had learned to nibble only a sliver and wait 20 minutes before swallowing. If nausea hit, you'd spit discreetly into your sleeve and pretend a faint cough caused your retching. Hunger never killed a concubine. Suspicion did. Between these heart attacks, there was the endless regime of training. Young women were drilled in calligraphy until their fingers bled ink, trained in music until they could play the zither blindfolded, and instructed in poetry until they could recite Tang verses in their sleep. Cultural refinement wasn't optional, it was mandatory. Every twist of the brushstroke, every bending of the bamboo string, was measured against an invisible rubric designed by the most persnickety court ladies in history. Medicine was equally absurd. If you caught a cold, you were prescribed powdered deer antler and frost lotus petals, expensive remedies reserved for the elite. Even if plain ginger tea would have done the trick. Sneezing in public earned you a lecture on imperial dignity, as though a bout of the sniffles could unravel the mandate of heaven. Best of all, there were the emperor's announcements, those cryptic edicts slipped under chamber doors at dawn. Concubine number 43 is hereby instructed to present herself in the Hall of Harmony at the next full moon. Congratulations, you made the cut for mysterious late-night audiences. No one ever told you whether this meant elevation to greater favor or disposal? Either way, it wrecked your sleep cycle. Then came the social life, if you could call it that. Alliances formed and shattered like porcelain, and often ended in someone's dismembered dreams. Concubines paired up, trading gossip and secret herbs to ease cramps, trading favors for extra rice, exchanging confidences about which eunuch liked to skim lipstick and who had a crush on the head librarian. But friendships were as fragile as jade. One misworded compliment to the emperor and your best friend could vanish overnight, whisked away to a remote palace lodge or worse, to a charcoal-baked death for alleged witchcraft. As the months crawled by, many concubines slipped into a state of perpetual paranoia. Mirrors became totems of terror. Whose reflection did you see today? The radiant beauty who dazzled the selection court, or the pale shadow who trembled at every footstep? Walls had ears, lanterns had eyes. Your silence was a weapon against eavesdroppers, but it was also your chains. Amid this chaos, rumors swirled of a secret clique known as the Jade Circle, a group of senior concubines who wielded more power than the official consorts. If you pledged loyalty to them, you might secure protection from poisoning. But the cost was high. Initiation required signing a blood pact, literally, by pricking your finger and letting the droplets mingle in a jade chalice. Fail their tests, and your blood was drained in a far more permanent way. Despite the dystopian absurdity, some concubines found small rebellions to keep their sanity. Late at night, they'd smuggle scraps of poetry into hidden alcoves, reciting lines of Li Bai and Du Fu by candlelight. They'd carve tiny blossoms into their wooden combs, hoping to carry a sliver of nature's freedom into their lacquered cages. A few even kept secret journals chronicling every humiliation and fleeting triumph, burning the pages when they thought no one was watching. Pregnancy was greeted with equal measures of hope and dread. On the one hand, bearing the emperor's child could vault you into a life of comparative safety. No one dared poison the mother of a prince. On the other, you'd endure monthly examinations by palace physicians who felt you'd followed your part of the bargain by providing royal heirs. A missed appointment wasn't tolerated, a lost pregnancy wasn't mourned. It was logged as failure of duty. When a concubine finally gave birth, there was a lavish ceremony involving thousands of plates of sweet rice, silver anklets for the newborn, and official portraits painted on silk scrolls. But these celebrations were as fleeting as morning dew. Naming ceremonies happened in hushed rooms where the emperor inspected every finger and eyelash, ensuring the baby looked sufficiently imperial. Any hint of deformity could be spun into a conspiracy. Foreign meddling, witchcraft, the concubine's own moral failure. Rarely did such children live to adulthood. The pressure was too immense, the court too cutthroat. Meanwhile, outside the palace walls, news of the harem's opulence fueled peasant unrest. Taxed to the bone, villagers whispered that their daughters might one day be dragged into this web of silk and steel. In remote provinces, families broke heirlooms in despair, grateful to avoid the draft of beauties. Yet, rumors persisted. Some regions claimed to have raised concubines so cunning they manipulated the emperor himself, building secret empires within the Forbidden City. Were they myth, propaganda, or genuine tales of women who turned the test of their bodies into a test of wits? By the time 4 years had passed, most concubines aged out. Their fortunes varied. A few were demoted to palace servants, serving the next batch of aspirants with hollow smiles. Others retired to distant estates, granted stipends, but haunted by nightmares of inspection rooms and shattered promises. A fortunate handful became dowager consorts, sipping tea in spacious pavilions. Their only battles now played out over embroidery patterns and supply requests to the imperial treasury. And then there were the tragic few who never left. Historians whisper of concubines entombed alive in secret crypts beneath the palace, eliminated as inconvenient relics. Some say these were later generations' cautionary tales, meant to keep new concubines terrified into obedience. Others believe the legends were invented to scandalize foreigners and distract from more mundane palace intrigues. Through it all, the legacy of the virginity test lingered long after the last emperor fell. Even in Republican China and beyond, moral purity remained a yardstick for women's honor, a relic of an era when a girl's fate was decided by the most intimate parts of her anatomy. The stories of those lost concubines echo in modern debates about bodily autonomy and the policing of female sexuality. So the next time you hear someone romanticize life behind palace walls, remember the hidden fractures beneath the guilt, the examinations in dim chambers, the alliances painted in blood, the simmering fear that love could be filed under royal business. Because in Imperial China, a single test defined thousands of lives, and the cost of passing or failing was nothing short of existence itself. Spring rain slicked the palace rooftops when whispers began circulating of a new favor, an elusive title known only as the Willow Maiden. No one outside the inner court knew precisely what it conferred, but the rumor mill painted it as the pinnacle of concubine status, access to private gardens, silk pavilions bathed in moonlight, and most importantly, unparalleled influence over palace affairs. For many concubines, Willow Maiden was the carrot dangled in front of the tired, trembling women who'd already bled for every inch of recognition. How did one earn such a title? Officially, by capturing the emperor's attention and keeping it long enough to prove loyalty, wit, and unparalleled grace. Unofficially, it involved bribery, espionage, and according to some scandal sheets, a clandestine duel fought at dawn in a lotus pond with poetry. The odds of winning? Slim. The price of failure? Deadly. Into this frenzy stepped concubine Lin, a young woman whose cheeks bore the faintest blush of provincial innocence and whose mind was sharp as a day-old razor. Born to a minor official in Sichuan, she arrived at the court clutching a lacquered comb carved by her grandmother. She recited Confucian aphorisms in her sleep, yet she refused to believe that fate was sealed by birth or by blood. Within months, Lin learned the palace's true curriculum. Observation. She watched how senior consort Zhao moved, her fingers trailing silk, eyes darting for every flicker of the emperor's gaze. She studied Eunuch Wu's ledger entries, noting which concubines received extra rice or insufficient bedding, and she listened, oh how she listened, to the hushed counsel passed behind silk curtains, seizing gossip like a sparrow gathers seeds. Her strategy was both simple and audacious, to be everywhere yet nowhere. When the emperor wandered the corridors, Lin would appear at the edge of his vision, a living portrait of demure elegance. She never spoke unless spoken to, but carried herself with a gravity that hinted at quiet intelligence. In music lessons, she played the guqin not to dazzle, but to soothe, leading tired ears into reveries of bamboo forests and moonlit grottos. Meanwhile, rival concubines plotted her downfall. They slipped notes into her meals, veiled insults comparing her to disobedient servants. They tainted her calligraphy brushes with diluted ink so her writing blurred. They bribed minor eunuchs to misplace her slippers. Lin endured it all with a calm that made her adversaries seethe. Their fury only made her more intriguing to the emperor, who, bored by palace theatrics, began asking after the quiet newcomer. One evening, during the Festival of Lanterns, the emperor hosted a poetry recital. Hundreds of lanterns bobbed on the inner lake like floating stars. Concubines stood in ordered rows, reciting verses. When it came to Lin's turn, she stepped forward and delivered a freshly composed poem about a wounded dove that finds refuge in spring blossoms, a thinly veiled metaphor for her own plight. Her voice was steady, her words precise, each syllable hanging in the humid air like a silken tassel. The emperor paused, his gaze settling on her. Silence reigned, until he exhaled, amused and intrigued. He declared her poem both bold and delicate, a combination rarely found in the palace. That night, Lin received an invitation to his private study, the first time she'd been summoned without official fanfare. Inside the mahogany-clad room, Lin knelt on a tiger-skin rug, her heart pounding like a war drum. The emperor reclined on a carved dais, his expression inscrutable. He poured tea and offered a question as innocuous as it was perilous. Tell me, concubine Lin, what should a willow maiden truly be? Lin thought of the towering willow trees outside the Hall of Harmony, their slender branches swaying in the wind as if dancing. She thought of resilience, of bending without breaking. A "A willow maiden," she said, voice quiet but clear, "is one who finds strength and flexibility, who weathers each storm with grace, bending so she may stand again in sunlight." The emperor studied her, then smiled, a rare, luminous curve. He nodded, and the room's lantern seemed to glow brighter. Lin had won her moment, but the price remained unseen. From that day forward, she was expected to embody her own metaphor. Every slight, every rumor, every whispered plot would test her flexibility. One misstep, one broken branch, and she'd snap under pressure. As Lin ascended in favor, other concubines retaliated with escalating cruelty. They circulated a circulated pamphlet titled "On the Folly of the Willow Maiden," mocking her as a wind-blown weed. They bribed palace guards to lock her out of the communal baths on cold nights. They arranged for her zither to be replaced with a low-cost imitation, its strings buzzing discordantly. Yet Lin persisted. She crafted alliances with palace physicians, trading insights on herbal remedies for extra opium, which eased her sleepless nights. She befriended the head librarian, gaining access to forbidden texts on Taoist philosophy and military strategy. Slowly, she built a web of support that extended beyond the inner court, reaching eunuchs, maidservants, even distant provincial nobles who sent secret gifts. By the third year, Lin's name appeared on imperial edicts with greater frequency. She oversaw the decoration of a summer pavilion, choosing motifs of willows and cranes. A personal signature she discreetly hid in the lattice work. She hosted private tea ceremonies for the emperor, serving rare phoenix tears tea that his previous consorts couldn't procure. At each turn, she balanced flattery with subtle defiance, reminding the emperor she was more than a pretty face. All of this power, however, hinged on her purity, that single membrane inspected years ago in a cold, silent room. Lin knew that if anyone discovered she'd suffered a childhood accident, an innocuous fall from a peach tree, her entire reputation would crumble. She'd already spent years mastering the art of invisibility to rivals. Now she had to guard her secret against time itself, the only force more ruthless than palace intrigue. The emperor's health, too, began to falter. Smallpox outbreaks swept through the city, and he contracted a mild case that left him fevered and irritable. Concubines whispered that the throne was vulnerable, that the succession hung by a thread. In such moments, the court's greed sharpened. Every faction clamored to secure their candidates, to sway the emperor before it was too late. Lin, ever the strategist, used this chaos to her advantage. She read his fevered journals, documents documenting his dreams and nightmares, and wove subtle references into her poetry, as if she could interpret the empire's soul. The emperor, delirious on convalescent pillows, found solace in her presence, trusting her instincts more than those of his longtime consorts. And then came the fateful night when Lin was summoned back to the inspection chamber. Panic seized her chest. Had someone uncovered her childhood fall? Was she to be tested again? This time for loyalty, chastity, or treason? The eunuchs who escorted her were expressionless, their silence heavier than stone. Inside that chamber, lit by a single flickering torch, Lin stood ready. But the test was not what she feared. Instead of physicians, she found senior court officials and the emperor himself, seated in judgment. The flickering light revealed a jade plaque on the wall, inscribed with two characters, "True Willow." The emperor rose and stepped forward, placing a hand on Lin's shoulder. "We tested your body once," he said softly, "but today we test your spirit." He gestured to a scroll on the table, a decree naming Lin as the first official Willow Maiden, granting her unprecedented authority to manage palace affairs and oversee the welfare of all consorts. Lin bowed so deeply her forehead touched the cold stone floor. Relief, triumph, terror, they all roared inside her. She had succeeded, transcending the physical test that once defined her. Yet she understood that this new title was both gift and burden, a mantle woven from intrigue, sacrifice, and ever-present danger. As the court erupted in hushed applause, Lin rose, her spirit a willow bending once more, but this time with the promise of true agency. The palace's future, and perhaps the empire's, now rested on her delicate yet unbreakable strength. Lin's coronation as the first official Willow Maiden marked the turning point of her life, and the palace itself. No more silent glimpses from behind silk curtains, no more forced smiles at poisoned banquets. Yet freedom in the Forbidden City was never absolute. Title or no title, Lin remained a cog in an imperial machine fueled by paranoia and palace intrigue. Her first edict as Willow Maiden was to reform the examination procedures for new concubines, at least on paper. She ordered the dismantling of the dreaded inspection room, and proclaimed that all future assessments would focus on talent and virtue, not biological proof of virginity. Eunuchs rolled their eyes, veteran court ladies laughed behind embroidered fans, but Lin insisted. She argued that the state would be better served by women who could navigate politics, diplomacy, and culture, skills far more valuable than a fragile membrane. In practice, few believed Lin would succeed. Palace walls were as porous as gossip. The day after her decree, a junior consort was found sobbing in the moonlight, convinced her own examination would be resurrected. Lin comforted her with a steady hand, promising that new standards would apply, assuming the officials did not stage a midnight coup in the halls of bureaucracy. To cement her authority, Lin negotiated alliances with powerful eunuch factions. She granted them limited access to her private chambers, where she treated them with respect, listening to their grievances about unfair work quotas and the constant threat of palace eunuchs being executed for alleged conspiracies. In return, eunuchs discreetly misplaced certain petitions that threatened Lin's reforms, and ensured that her orders reached reluctant nobles in the outer court with minimal delay. Reorganizing palace life was only half the battle. Lin's more ambitious plan involved the women themselves. She launched clandestine salons in hidden alcoves, a daring revival of Tang-era gatherings, where women debated poetry, philosophy, and even rudimentary medicine. These salons were whispered about among concubines as the only space where they could speak without fear of eavesdropping. Attendees scribbled notes on scraps of rice paper, passing them hand to hand under the flicker of hidden lanterns. From these salons emerged a fragile network of solidarity. Concubines shared herbal remedies for menstrual pains, tips for navigating palace schedules, and most revolutionary of all, small loans of silk and silver to tide each other over lean months. Word reached the emperor, through channels sanitized by loyal eunuchs, that morale among the women was improving, and that palace operations were running more smoothly than ever. Lin's greatest test came when the emperor fell seriously ill late in the dry winter. Fever sapped his strength, and court physicians despaired, offering remedies ranging from powdered dragon bones to mystical talismans. Foreign envoys whispered that the dynasty teetered on the brink of collapse. Succession plots bubbled beneath the surface as rival consorts maneuvered to promote their sons. Lin refused to panic. Drawing on the emperor's fevered diaries and her own observations, she insisted on a simple regimen: rest, nourishing broths, and gentle massages with jasmine-infused oil. She visited him daily, her presence a calm counterpoint to the frenzied court. She read him passages from Taoist texts, reminding him that the mandate of heaven favored harmony, not hysteria. Slowly, the emperor's color returned. When he finally opened his eyes, he looked at Lin not as a concubine, but as a steward of his well-being. He honored her with a public ceremony in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, unprecedented for a woman of concubine rank, and awarded her a jade fan carved with willow motifs. In the emperor's speech, he spoke of Lin's unwavering spirit of flexibility, lauding her for guiding the court through crisis. Yet triumph carried its own poisons. Lin's reformist edict stirred resentment among high consorts who saw her as an upstart threatening their ancient privileges. One by one, old guard officials began shelving her petitions, sowing doubt about her motives. Rumors surfaced that Lin sought to usurp power, that she aimed to install herself as Empress Dowager in the event of the emperor's death. Whispered campaigns attacked her lineage, alleging that her father's minor official post was fictitious and that her bloodline was tainted by disloyal rebels. Lin faced these attacks with steely resolve. She invited her accusers to public debates in the newly revived salons, forcing them to defend their positions in front of assembled concubines and eunuchs. She marshaled testimonies from provincial nobles who had benefited from her outreach programs, and eunuch allies spoke of her kindness and competence. Under the flicker of hidden lanterns and the weight of public witness, her detractors found their arguments unraveling like poorly spun silk. Still, palace politics remained a relentless tide. During a banquet to celebrate the emperor's recovery, a high consort discreetly laced Lin's tea with a mild sedative. Halfway through the evening, Lin's vision blurred, and she collapsed, her forehead landing on the lacquered table. Courtiers gasped, some rushed to help, while others seized the moment to whisper that her malady was proof of unfitness for leadership. When Lin awoke, she found herself in a small chamber, her body feverish and weak. Beside her sat Eunuch Wu, the most loyal of her initial allies. "They tried to silence you," he whispered, pressing a bowl of restorative broth to her lips. "But you did not fail." She sipped the broth and felt its warmth spread, grounding her resolve. Within days, Lin returned to court, her face pale but determined. She summoned the suspected consort to the hall of examination and confronted her publicly with evidence smuggled by eunuch informants, spices from a remote province used as sedative, found in the high consort's private stores. Faced with undeniable proof and the emperor's stern gaze, the consort bowed her head in surrender. As punishment, she was stripped of her title and confined to a remote palace lodge, never to be seen again. The episode marked a turning point. Lin's authority was consolidated. Her reforms, once mocked as impossible, became law. The inspection room remained closed, its doors bolted forever. Examination of concubines focused on skill, character, and loyalty, not anatomy. Poetry salons flourished, with hidden manuscripts eventually distributed to provincial libraries. Concubines gained modest stipends and shared housing quarters designed to foster camaraderie instead of competition. For Lin personally, however, the cost was high. Years of vigilance had aged her beyond her years. Her heart bore the scars of betrayals and near deaths, her nights haunted by dreams of dark chambers and broken promises. Yet she found solace in small victories: a young consort who painted a willow motif on her fan in gratitude, an old eunuch who thanked her for ending decades of unjust examinations, a provincial scholar who dedicated a book of poems to her vision of a more humane court. When the emperor died suddenly one autumn night, possibly of lingering effects of his smallpox infection, Lin faced her greatest challenge yet. Palace law dictated that all concubines without sons were to be confined to nunneries to prevent them from influencing the new ruler. Lin, lacking a surviving heir of her own, prepared for exile. But the imperial will contained a final surprise. Lin was granted the title of Empress Dowager's advisor, a unique position created in her honor. In this role, she oversaw the transition between emperors, ensuring stability and continuing her reforms. She never regained the intimate audience she'd once enjoyed with her late emperor, but she discovered a quieter power, one rooted in institutional change rather than personal favor. In her twilight years, Lin retired to a modest pavilion overlooking a willow grove outside the palace. She walked among the trees she had long admired, their branches swaying in wind and sun alike. Mothers from nearby villages brought their daughters to meet her, telling them of the woman who had ended the tyranny of the virginity test and brought learning back to the harem. Lin taught them poetry, music, and critical thought, skills she believed truly defined a woman's worth. Thus, the legacy of the virginity test faded into history, replaced by a court culture where a woman's body was no longer state property but her own domain. Lin's story became a legend, whispered in salons and inscribed in annals as proof that even the most absurd institutions could be dismantled by those with courage, wit, and unbreakable spirit. And somewhere in the willow grove, if you listen closely, you can still hear the rustle of leaves, carrying the echo of Lin's final lesson, that true purity lies not in untouched flesh, but in the resilience to bend without breaking, to transform pain into purpose, and to survive, sometimes against impossible odds, in the most absurd of worlds. Imagine planning your wedding, everything perfect, the dress, the feast, the awkward drunk uncle, but just before the ceremony, a messenger arrives and says, "Sorry, the emperor will be sleeping with your wife first," and you're expected to smile, bow, and say, "Of course, your majesty." Sounds insane? Welcome to one of the most jaw-dropping, historically bizarre, and soul-crushing traditions mankind has ever tolerated. Before you smash your furniture in righteous outrage, like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. Let's start with the ancient and uncomfortably real concept of droit du seigneur, or jus primae noctis, which translates to the right of the first night. According to legend, this was the legal or customary right of a ruling lord or king to sleep with a subordinate's bride on her wedding night before her husband could. And if you're already grinding your teeth, yes, it was exactly as creepy and exploitative as it sounds. But here's where it gets messy. Did this actually happen? Was it law, or just a horrifying rumor designed to keep peasants trembling in fear and submission? The answer is complicated, and that's why this story is so juicy. Let's rewind the clock to medieval Europe, where the combination of superstition, religion, and feudal tyranny created the perfect cocktail of human misery. Most peasants lived under the thumb of a local lord who owned their land, their crops, their taxes, and sometimes their wives' dignity. And in some regions, it was believed, or at least whispered, that the lord had the right to take the virginity of a peasant bride before the wedding night. Was it law? Not exactly. But did that stop some aristocrats from exercising this tradition anyway? Not even a little. The term droit du seigneur didn't show up in legal texts until centuries after the Middle Ages, which means that if this right did exist, it was likely enforced through power, not parchment. In other words, no one wrote it down because no one had the guts or the ink to challenge it. And this wasn't just a European fantasy. Versions of this supposed right pop up all over the historical map, from the Scottish Highlands to Imperial China, from Mongol warlords to Mesopotamian kings. It seems that whenever humans invented centralized power, someone eventually asked, "Hey, what if I also got to sleep with your wife?" And everyone else nervously laughed, unsure if it was a joke or their new job description. Let's take a particularly bleak example, ancient Mesopotamia. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, our dear hero King Gilgamesh was known for a lot of things: slaying monsters, wrestling with gods, and you guessed it, sleeping with brides on their wedding night. It wasn't just a pervy flex, it was his royal right. According to the epic, Gilgamesh does not leave a son to his father. Day and night he arrogantly takes the girl from her mother and uses her. Romantic? No. The people hated this. In fact, it was one of the reasons the gods created Enkidu, to challenge Gilgamesh's abuse of power. So in this version, at least, divine intervention came to stop royal perversion. Small win for justice. Sort of. Flash forward a couple of millennia and land in Scotland, where the legend of Prima Nocte took on dramatic new flair. During the reign of Edward I, aka Longshanks, aka the villain from Braveheart, it was rumored that English lords imposed the first night right on their newly conquered Scottish vassals. Hollywood loved this idea. Braveheart leaned into it hard. Remember the part where a noble rides in and claims a newlywed bride like she's a side of beef? It made for great cinema, and was about as historically accurate as unicorn jousting. Most modern historians agree. Edward I was a brutal colonialist, yes, but he probably didn't institutionalize mass marital rape as policy. Still, the fear of such a practice was real enough that it stuck in Scottish lore for centuries. And that's the real point here. Even if it wasn't always happening, people believed it could, and that belief was power. Now, let's drift eastward to Imperial China, where we meet one of the most chilling and bureaucratically efficient versions of the practice, Shengyun, or first night inspection. In certain dynasties, especially during the Ming and Qing periods, provincial governors or noble lords would require brides of the lower class to report to their estates before consummating their marriage. In some cases, this was framed as a test, not of morality, but of loyalty to the empire. The bride was expected to present herself to the local official, who would then decide whether she was fit for marriage. You can imagine how that inspection often ended. If the lord was pleased, the bride returned to her husband days later, usually traumatized and silent. If not, she might vanish altogether. Her husband would be expected to thank the governor for the honor. But perhaps the most horrifyingly well-documented variation comes from feudal Japan, particularly under the daimyo system. Local warlords held nearly godlike authority over their provinces, and while prima nocte wasn't law, it was part of the unspoken privileges of status. Some daimyo hosted elaborate wedding feasts, where the groom would ceremoniously offer his bride to the lord as a sign of loyalty. The guests would cheer, the groom would bow, the bride would be escorted to a private chamber. And somewhere between ritual and reality, consent was lost in translation. Why didn't people resist? They did, but resistance often came at an unimaginable cost. In parts of Europe, entire villages rebelled, quietly, by marrying in secret or eloping to avoid lord's notice. Some communities developed code systems using colors or symbols to indicate whether a woman had been taken. In parts of China, underground networks of midwives helped hide newlyweds or fabricate medical evidence of virginity after the fact. In Japan, some families sent daughters far away to marry in secret, risking exile to preserve dignity. And yet, many complied, because refusing wasn't just dishonor, it was treason. It could mean execution, exile, or the destruction of your entire bloodline. Your fields burned, your siblings enslaved, your village razed to the ground as a lesson to others. One of the most grotesque aspects of the custom, wherever it appeared, was the public theater of it all. Lords didn't just violate women in private, they made a show of it. It was about humiliation, spectacle, and the assertion that your body, even your marriage, belonged to the throne. So, was this a real, widespread legal practice? Short answer, probably not in the way movies or legends suggest. Long answer, it didn't need to be legal to be terrifyingly real. Power doesn't need paperwork, it just needs silence, fear, and a system that treats women's bodies as currency in a feudal economy of obedience. What's truly disturbing is how long this idea lingered, not just in folklore, but in the subconscious of society. Even centuries later, the fear of powerful men taking what they want, when they want, hasn't really disappeared. We've just upgraded the language. Modern scandals echo the same grotesque melody, abuse cloaked in privilege, violations hidden behind doors with gold handles. And history? Well, history gives us the receipts, buried in myths, epics, and court records that read more like crime reports than governance. Let's say you're a newlywed peasant in the 14th century Europe. Your beloved is radiant in her humble linen veil. Your family is ready to celebrate. The stew is bubbling. The sheep are blissfully unaware they're the evening's centerpiece. But then comes the knock. And not just any knock, the kind that says, "The Lord has decided your love life is under review." That knock meant the party just turned into a power play. Because your wife? She wasn't yours yet, not until the local noble had his first look. Not the cute wedding photo kind, either. This was the kind where a man in silk tights and a powdered wig had the final say on your honeymoon plans. Now, let's get something straight. The so-called rite of the first night wasn't typically written into law books, not in France, not in England, not even in the Holy Roman Empire. But laws are only part of the story. In the feudal world, custom trumped legality, and if your lord wanted something done, it usually got done. Whether it was feeding his horses, building his castle, or sharing your wife. You could file a complaint, sure, right after you rose from the grave where they'd bury you for treason. And that's the insidious brilliance of power. It rarely needs ink and seal. It just needs fear, tradition, and a few well-timed executions to keep the myth alive. In Catalonia, around the 15th century, records show that newlyweds had to pay a cruelty tax to avoid the local baron claiming his mythical knight. Think of it like wedding insurance, except the deductible was your dignity. Some historians suggest this tax might have been a clever way for nobles to profit from a fake right. But ask yourself this, if someone threatens your wife and then says, "Unless you pay me," do you care if it's technically law? The tax or your bride strategy wasn't limited to Spain. In France, it was called the droit de cuissage. In Germany, it was Herrenrecht. Across cultures, the idea wasn't always that the lord would definitely sleep with the bride, but that he could if he wanted to. That unspoken maybe was more than enough to keep peasants terrified, compliant, and quietly resentful. Unless you think it was all about peasant girls. Oh no. Sometimes the privilege extended to noble women too, especially if their families had fallen out of political favor. In some royal courts, a disgraced noble might offer his daughter or sister to the king as a gift in a sick display of loyalty. It was both groveling and horrifying, a literal sacrifice to the god of power. Meanwhile, in the Ottoman Empire, sultans didn't need legal justifications. They had harems, spies, eunuchs, and an entire bureaucratic machine dedicated to pleasure. But even so, the idea of the sultan sleeping with someone else's bride wasn't just a fantasy. It was part of a broader imperial appetite for dominance. Stories abound of provincial governors sending beautiful young women to the palace as tributes, often under the polite fiction of offering service. Sometimes these women were unmarried, sometimes newlywed, sometimes promised to someone else. None of it mattered once the imperial seal was involved. Now let's fly west again to medieval France, where things got especially theatrical. Some towns reportedly staged elaborate parades when the lord invoked his right. The bride would be dressed in white, veiled, and paraded to the castle gates like a prize hog. Trumpets would blare, banners would wave. The groom might even be expected to carry her up the steps himself before retreating to wait while his marriage was updated. And then, the next morning, she'd be returned. No counseling, no explanation, just a nod and a "you may now proceed." With what exactly? Her trauma, your shattered ego, a baby you're now legally required to raise as your own? Think that's bleak? We're only halfway down this tunnel of absurdity. In Tibet, before its annexation by modern China, some ethnic groups followed customs where lamas or tribal chiefs would sleep with brides as part of a sacred purification ritual. Yes, they called it spiritual. No, that didn't make it less exploitative. Religion has a long history of covering power plays in incense and chanting. And in Imperial China, let's return briefly to the twisted bureaucracy of the virginity inspection. You'd think this was already cruel enough, but no, there was a system, a ranking system. If a provincial governor found a virgin to be exceptionally beautiful or particularly pure, he might send her to the imperial harem instead of letting her marry. Imagine that. Instead of a wedding night, you win a one-way trip to a lifetime of cloistered servitude. Congratulations, you're now royal property. What's more disturbing is how complicit communities became in enforcing these practices. Parents, yes, parents, would prepare daughters for the possibility that they might have to serve the Lord before marrying. Elders taught silence, wives taught endurance. No one questioned the tradition, because questioning could mean the ruin of your family. And don't forget the groom. He had to sit with his hands in his lap and pretend this was honorable, like being cuckolded with some kind of medieval Nobel Peace Prize. Refusing to cooperate wasn't just disrespectful, it was interpreted as treasonous insubordination. So he'd stand outside the castle door, head bowed, listening to the slow tick of misery, hoping his future children would never ask, "Why does our oldest sibling look nothing like us?" The worst part, in many cases, these men, these husbands, were expected to thank the Lord afterward, bow, kiss his hand, smile through teeth grinding so hard they could mill flour, because it was an honor to be chosen. Your wife? She was a symbol of your loyalty, your devotion, your utter lack of rights. And that's the real tragedy here. This wasn't just physical exploitation, it was psychological warfare, an act of social castration. The message was clear. Even the one thing most personal to you, your marriage, your love, your bed, is mine, and you will smile about it. Did every nobleman take part in this? Number. But enough did that the legend endured for centuries. And if history teaches us anything, it's this. Even a lie, repeated often enough, can become an institution. Now, let's be cynical for a second, because history loves cynics. Some historians argue that the myth of prima nocte was exaggerated or fabricated later as political propaganda. For example, French revolutionaries used it as evidence of aristocratic depravity to justify guillotining the nobility. And yes, there's some evidence that later chroniclers embellished the horror for effect. But ask yourself, if it was completely made up, why does it show up in so many cultures? So many myths? So many legal side notes, ballads, oral traditions, complaints, and secret wedding rituals meant to avoid it? This is the part where history and horror blend into folklore. Not because the story wasn't real, but because it was too real, too shameful, too raw to admit openly. So instead, it became legend, whispers. A ghost story peasants told their daughters with one eye on the castle. By now, you might be asking, how did this all end? What stopped this madness? Two things, religion and revolution. The growing power of the church, especially in Europe, started to challenge lords' sexual privileges by emphasizing the sacredness of marriage. Virginity was no longer just about power, it was suddenly about purity. Ironically, the same patriarchy that once enabled abuse began enforcing new moral codes that, at least on paper, protected brides from defilement. But real change came with the rise of centralized monarchies and legal systems. Kings didn't want petty lords asserting rogue sexual rights. It disrupted tax collection and caused peasant unrest. And as modern courts replaced feudal fiefdoms, the idea of a noble owning his subject's body became increasingly indefensible. By the 18th century, most countries had outlawed any form of enforced consort rights, even if they were never truly legal to begin with. But don't get too hopeful. Enforced sexual access didn't disappear. It just evolved into workplace harassment, into cults, into prisons, into any system where power and sex are separated only by a locked door and a blind eye. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a warning label, because the nightmare of Jus primae noctis isn't really gone. It just learned how to wear a suit, or a title, or a polite smile. In part 3, we're going to dive into the cultural echoes of this horror show. The paintings, poems, songs, secret codes, and dark jokes that people left behind as psychological coping mechanisms. Because when you can't change your fate, sometimes all you can do is sing about it, or carve it into a church wall when no one's watching. It's said that when people can't fight back, they make art, or jokes, or myths so biting they leave scars in the collective memory. And when it came to the so-called rite of the first night, the world did exactly that. It mocked, mourned, and mythologized the pain until it echoed in every village tale, every tavern song, every scribbled margin of a dusty parchment. Welcome to the emotional aftershock of a historical trauma so absurd, it mutated into culture. Let's start with the songs. In 16th century France, peasants sang dirty ballads behind barn doors, songs with barely concealed rage, veiled under bawdy humor. One infamous folk tune called La Nuit du Seigneur tells the story of a young bride being led to the manor under moonlight, while the groom drinks himself senseless on the porch. The chorus? A mixture of laughter and despair. Let the Lord enjoy her while the stew gets cold. The crowd roared at the absurdity, but the pain was never far beneath the surface. Even in the Scottish Highlands, a region known more for warriors than troubadours, folk ballads preserved whispers of something dark. Some songs reference bed rights taken by the laird, with lines like, "He came not for bread nor coin, but to taste what I had wed." Romantic it was not. And then there was art, because when words failed, images didn't. In the woodcuts of the late medieval period, we see caricatures of fat, leering nobles dragging terrified brides into shadowy halls, while skeletal priests looked the other way. Some artists were bold enough to include devils standing behind the Lord, whispering into his ear, while the groom clutches his hat and weeps. It was grotesque, symbolic, and brutally honest. There's a famous 15th century fresco in northern Italy showing a wedding scene. On the surface, everything looks lovely, but in the background, half hidden behind a curtain, a nobleman peers at the couple with unmistakable intent. Subtle, chilling, almost theatrical. And that's the thing, drama became the next weapon. Plays in the Renaissance era began to incorporate the theme of prima nocte as a kind of socio-political satire. In Molière's time, French playwrights used the idea as a stand-in for every abuse of power. One anonymous play, circulated secretly, features a scene where a nobleman enters the bridal chamber only to find the bride armed with a frying pan. She beats him senseless while the chorus sings, "The only right is fright." A comedy? On the surface. But for the oppressed watching, it was catharsis in velvet tights. The English weren't immune either. Shakespeare doesn't reference prima nocte explicitly, but his obsession with forced marriages, disguised identities, and marriage as a power struggle certainly nods in that direction. In Measure for Measure, a judge threatens to execute a man unless the man's sister sleeps with him. Sound familiar? History doesn't rhyme, it plagiarizes with flair. Let's not forget visual symbolism. Some brides in medieval Europe took to wearing belts made of iron or chainmail, not for purity, but as protest. These chastity belts weren't actually locked by husbands, as the myth goes. They were symbolic defenses against those in power. Think of it as a wearable sarcasm, the medieval version of a protest sign. And those belts weren't the only subversive symbols. In medieval stained glass, a recurring motif appears, a bride with a lamb, often bleeding. On its own, innocent, but in context, the message was clear: sacrifice, powerlessness, and sometimes revenge. One rare panel from a Bavarian church shows a young bride kneeling before Christ while behind her, a lord recoils in fear, his face half rotted. That's not theology, that's shade 14th century style. Then there were the coded stories passed down generation to generation. In Russia, peasant fairy tales emerged with strange narratives. A king who demands to bless every wedding in his land, until one clever girl disguises herself as a hag to escape his touch. She's rewarded with gold and becomes queen. It sounds whimsical until you realize the tale is a blueprint for survival under tyranny. In India, some tribal folk tales tell of kings who test brides for purity, only to be cursed by the gods when they cross a sacred threshold. In one version, the ground swallows the monarch whole on the wedding night. Children laughed, but their parents nodded, silently hoping karma was listening. And in Japan, kabuki theater sometimes touched on the subject in allegorical form. Lords who seduce innocent girls are haunted by fox spirits. One fox even returns night after night, tearing at the lord's bedding until he goes mad. The fox was more than a trickster. It was vengeance with fur. Everywhere this twisted tradition traveled, it left behind psychological footprints. Brides in many regions would try to uglify themselves before their wedding night, rubbing ash on their faces, cutting their hair, or binding their breasts to avoid drawing attention. Some even pretended to be mentally ill, not for fun, for survival, because beauty was a liability in a system that turned women into collateral. Parents invented pre-marriage rituals to delay ceremonies. One Scottish village reportedly held weddings only during torrential rainstorms, hoping the noble wouldn't bother traveling in mud. Another community in Hungary held fake weddings with decoy brides just to confuse nosy knights. Let's take a brief bitter stroll into legal archives now. There's a chilling document from 14th century Aragon in modern-day Spain, where a man sued a baron after his wife died during her obligatory service on their wedding night. The judge dismissed the case. Why? Because the baron claimed she had consented. After all, she walked into the castle herself. Never mind the 5 armed guards that escorted her. In Germany, court records show a bizarre loophole. A peasant could challenge the lord's claim by offering his livestock in exchange for the bride's honor. One poor soul offered 12 goats, 3 pigs, and a cart of barley. The lord accepted, and then claimed the bride anyway, saying the livestock were compensation, not negotiation. This wasn't just abuse, it was a theater of humiliation. And yet, people found ways to resist, quietly, dangerously. Some communities formed secret bridal societies, where women trained each other in defensive tactics, how to escape, how to bribe a servant, how to feign illness or death. In one French village, women kept belladonna in their bodices, ready to poison themselves before surrendering to a noble. Drastic? Absolutely. But for them, dignity was worth dying for. And then there were the whistleblowers, the priests, monks, and minor officials who recorded abuses in secret diaries. One monk in 15th century Wales wrote, "Better the flock rise in rage than be fleeced in silence." That same monk disappeared a year later. His monastery burned down. Coincidence? Probably not. What's fascinating and heartbreaking is how these stories persisted long after the practice was supposedly abolished. In post-feudal Europe, even as laws modernized, the trauma remained. People still whispered about old rites, brides still looked over their shoulders, and parents still taught daughters how to sleep with a knife under the mattress. Because when abuse is ritualized, it takes generations to undo. Even in the 19th century, Victorian writers picked up the theme, sometimes as historical curiosity, sometimes as erotic fantasy. The idea that power could demand intimacy fascinated a society obsessed with control. Novels like The Lord's Right and Bride's Night used the legend as a plot device. But behind the fiction was a centuries-old scream. By the early 20th century, historians began debating, did this right ever really exist? Was it all just myth? And here's where the real tragedy lies. Whether it was enforced by decree, tax, implication, or terror, it existed enough to enter law books, legends, and family trauma, enough to alter the course of millions of lives, and enough to teach us how easily power corrupts the most sacred bonds. In Part 4, we'll look at how this grotesque legacy shaped modern systems of gender, consent, and power. We'll trace its shadow through colonial laws, imperial fantasies, and the ongoing struggle for sexual autonomy around the globe. Because history doesn't just end, it lingers. So here we are, peering over the edge of history's most uncomfortable cliff. You've made it through the folklore, the fear, the farce, and now we dive into the aftershocks. Because like all abuses of power, the so-called right of the first night didn't vanish quietly into the pages of forgotten scrolls. No, it evolved. It adapted, it disguised itself in new language and slithered into modern systems with a smug little smirk. You see, when brute force goes out of style, bureaucracy steps in. After the decline of feudal structures and the Enlightenment's awkward attempt to humanize laws, while still marginalizing most people, the ruling classes got clever. They didn't need to demand your bride anymore. They simply designed the world so you had no power to say no. Let's talk colonialism. During the height of European expansion, the right of the first night didn't get left behind. Oh no, it got packed right next to the Bible's muskets and smallpox. Colonial administrators often exploited native customs or invented them to justify their own lust. In French-occupied North Africa, officers sometimes demanded hospitality rights from tribal leaders, which suspiciously included a tent, a meal, and access to the chieftain's daughter. It wasn't law, it didn't need to be. It was tradition, now with epaulets. In India, under the British Raj, there were whispered cases of colonial officers taking local brides under their protection. A euphemism as oily as a boiled wig, the colonial state rarely intervened unless property was at stake. Women's bodies, not so much. And in the Congo Free State, Belgium's lovely little humanitarian nightmare, women were routinely forced to serve soldiers as wives in exchange for their village's safety. It wasn't called just primi noctis, but the result was just as devastating. Choice reduced to survival. Consent as a commodity. Even outside colonized regions, the practice of using power to demand intimacy persisted in gentler, more insidious forms. Take the French court of Louis XV. The king was known for his string of mistresses, many of whom were teenagers plucked from convents or noble households. Sure, they were willing. After all, their families stood to gain wealth and favor. But when the alternative is poverty or shame, is it really a choice? One especially disturbing institution was the Parc aux Cerfs, a literal pleasure park for Louis XV, where young girls were housed and summoned at his will. A child, turned into a decorative object, paraded for titillation and labeled fortunate. Fast forward to Victorian England, where class and gender politics danced a poisonous waltz. Servants, especially maids, were frequently subject to their employers' attention. Again, no law sanctioned it. None needed. If you were a working-class woman, your virtue was just another perk in your employer's benefits package. Speak up, and you'd be labeled a temptress. Resist, and you'd be dismissed without reference. A death sentence for the poor. Even literature couldn't resist revisiting the grotesque glamour of power-based intimacy. In Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Thomas Hardy paints the titular Tess as a victim of class, beauty, and predatory entitlement. She is, essentially, sacrificed to a system where her body is currency, and once spent, never worth the same again. It's prima noct all over again, just in corsets and prose. And then came the 20th century. War, revolution, industrialization. The world moved fast, but some horrors refused to be left behind. During World War II, occupying forces often imposed their will on conquered women. The Nazi regime systematically raped and trafficked women in Eastern Europe, while the Japanese Imperial Army maintained so-called comfort stations, where thousands of Korean, Chinese, and Southeast Asian women were enslaved for military morale. The state organized rape of women as a weapon of war. Nothing noble, nothing traditional. Just brutal echoes of the old right, dressed up in uniforms and national pride. Even in the post-war West, corporate patriarchy picked up the torch. In Hollywood's golden age, young actresses were famously told, "Sleep with the producer or lose the role." The casting couch wasn't just a joke, it was institutionalized coercion. And while no monarch demanded first-night rights anymore, the same message remained. If you want access to opportunity, your body may be the entry fee. One could argue that modern systems replace just primi noctis with power-based grooming, where consent becomes meaningless under the weight of survival, ambition, or fear, which brings us to the present day. Today, when we talk about sexual misconduct, abuse of power, or coerced consent, we're still grappling with the cultural fallout of centuries of normalized exploitation. It's not about medieval kings or drunken dukes anymore. It's about CEOs, politicians, landlords, bosses. The stage has changed, but the script remains tragically familiar. Why does this idea persist? Because it works. Because for thousands of years, systems have told men in power that access to women's bodies is a reward, and told women that resistance leads to ruin. But now, finally, things are shifting. We see this in movements like the Me Too movement, where survivors speak against the powerful with a collective voice that's impossible to silence. We see this in new laws that protect against workplace harassment, or in universities overhauling their policies on consent and accountability. We see it in the re-examination of historic figures, once romanticized, now understood through the lens of the damage they left behind. This is more than revision, it's reckoning. Historians now work to decode the myths, challenge the legends, and question the systems that let traditions like prima nocte flourish. Legal scholars examine how feudal abuse bled into contract law. Sociologists study how trauma from these customs echoes through generations of family behavior. Psychologists trace how collective shame and silence become inherited burdens. Because history isn't just something that happened. It's something we carry, something passed down in genes, in gestures, in fears too old to name. So what do we do with it? We name it. We drag it into the light, crownless and ridiculous, and say, this happened, this hurt, this was wrong. We stop romanticizing power and start questioning its price. We tell these stories, not for scandal, but for survival. For the women whose names were never recorded. For the men who stood by helpless. For the children born of silence and shame. And perhaps most importantly, we laugh at the absurdity of it all. Not because it was funny, but because absurdity is power's greatest weakness. So, if a future emperor ever dares to demand your wedding night, hand him this story and tell him, it didn't end well for your ancestors. History is heavy, but it's lighter when we refuse to carry its worst sins forward. Thank you for walking through this absurd nightmare of power, sex, and survival across the ages. If you made it this far, you've earned a drink, a nap, and maybe a good cry. But mostly, you've earned the right to know and remember how far we've come, and how much further we still have to go. Imagine spending your whole life competing for the affection of one man, only to be told that when he dies, you have to die too. Not symbolically, not emotionally, literally, alive in a tomb, with your dead boss husband tyrant. Welcome to the ancient tradition of burying concubines alive with the emperor, because apparently being ghosted wasn't brutal enough. Before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. It all begins in ancient China, where emperors were considered not just rulers, but living gods. And gods don't go to the afterlife alone, of course. Oh no, they go with an entourage. Enter the concubines. Let's be clear. Concubines weren't exactly girlfriends. They weren't wives either. They were a strange mix of sex worker, political pawn, and ornamental status symbol. A well-appointed emperor could have dozens, sometimes hundreds, each one chosen for her beauty, grace, family connections, or, if we're being honest, sheer proximity to power. Now, imagine spending your entire life behind palace walls, forbidden to leave, constantly monitored, your only job being to stay beautiful, silent, and available, and then being told you'll be sacrificed because your man kicked the jade-studded bucket. This wasn't metaphor, this was ritual. Historians believe the practice of live burial started in the Shang dynasty around 1600 BCE, where kings were buried with servants, guards, horses, and yes, concubines. Hundreds of human sacrifices were discovered at sites like Yingsu, where pits of skeletons lie in eerie formation around a royal tomb. But it wasn't until the Qin dynasty, with the notorious Emperor Qin Shi Huang, that things got architecturally apocalyptic. You may know him as the guy with the terracotta army. You know, that eerie collection of 8,000 clay soldiers guarding his mausoleum in death. What people talk about less are the actual human beings buried in his tomb complex. Not just guards, not just artisans, but concubines. According to ancient sources like Sima Qian, once Emperor Qin Shi Huang died, his childless concubines were ordered to follow him into death. The logic? If you weren't lucky enough to bear him a son, then at least you could keep him company in the afterlife. Talk about toxic, posthumous expectations. But here's where it gets extra cruel. These women weren't poisoned or quickly executed. Many were allegedly buried alive, sealed into chambers, suffocated beneath earth and stone, because nothing says eternal devotion like dying in the dark next to a corpse who never learned your name. This wasn't just a one-time horror show. The practice continued through multiple dynasties: Western Zhou, Han, and even Tang. Now, you might be asking, why? Why did they believe dragging concubines into death was necessary? Well, partly because the emperor was seen as the son of heaven, and his afterlife had to mirror his earthly life, complete with luxuries, guards, and sexual companionship. Concubines weren't women anymore. They were grave goods, like jewelry or gold statues with lungs. There was also a deep-rooted belief in spiritual utility. If you were loyal enough to follow your master into death, you might be reborn in a better life. If not, well, your spirit might wander forever, alone, forgotten. That kind of metaphysical blackmail kept a lot of people quiet. And let's not forget the classic motivator: fear. Refusing to die with the emperor wasn't an option. Your family could be punished, your legacy erased, your name stripped from the records like you never existed. And in ancient China, where ancestral honor was everything, that was a fate worse than death. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer logistics of this insanity. You die, the emperor dies, and suddenly the palace is scrambling to decide which concubines are worthy of death. Some might be chosen based on rank, others simply for being nearby when the imperial heart gave out. And then comes the ritual prep, dressing the women in funeral robes, placing charms on their bodies, painting talismans on the walls. It's all terribly sacred, and also completely horrifying. Sometimes they were placed in underground chambers. Other times they were tied, positioned like sleeping dolls around the emperor's sarcophagus. In some cases, the chambers were sealed slowly, giving them time to suffocate in pitch-black silence while the tomb was completed above. And before you start thinking this was a China-only thing, oh no. The idea of sacrificing women to follow powerful men into the afterlife was surprisingly global. In ancient Mesopotamia, royal courts often sacrificed servants and wives during funerals. The Sumerians buried women with harps, suggesting they were meant to play music for the dead king forever. In Egypt, early pharaohs were occasionally buried with wives or attendants, though this fell out of favor as mummification and statues took over. In India, there was the chilling practice of sati, where widows were encouraged or forced to throw themselves on their husband's funeral pyre. That continued well into the colonial period. And in Africa, kings in some cultures were buried with their wives, warriors, and slaves. Because apparently, patriarchy doesn't die, it just multiplies underground. Back in China, things began to shift after the Han Dynasty. The government began promoting Confucian ideals, which emphasized ritual propriety and humaneness. Human sacrifice was increasingly frowned upon, not because it was cruel, but because it was seen as a sign of bad governance. A ruler who needed dead people to accompany him clearly hadn't ruled well enough to be remembered kindly. So what did they do instead? They replaced concubines with clay figurines. Entire tombs were filled with thousands of tiny servants, dancers, and guards, each sculpted with care, ready to serve in the next world. Less messy, less murdery. But even as the live burials faded, the control over concubines never really ended. Women in the imperial harem were still considered property. They lived in isolation. They followed strict schedules. Their contact with the outside world was almost non-existent. If the emperor died and they weren't chosen to die with him, they were often sent to nunneries, forced into lifelong mourning, or locked into their quarters forever. Because God forbid a woman who once slept with the emperor got the chance to be happy. And now comes the most grotesque twist of all. Some emperors ordered their concubines to be killed, not so they could accompany them in the afterlife, but to prevent them from being with another man after they died. That's right, jealousy from beyond the grave. Even in death, the emperor's ego couldn't handle the idea of his former lovers moving on. So better to bury them, silenced, claimed, owned, because nothing says undying love like making sure no one else can ever have you, by literally making you die. In our next part, we'll plunge deeper into specific cases, names, dates, skeletons, and the emperors, whose paranoia and pride turned funerals into flesh-filled massacres. But for now, sit with this. Imagine being 19 years old. You've never left the palace. You've never seen the stars without a carved rooftop framing them. And now someone's knocking at your chamber door, telling you to get dressed in your finest silks. The emperor is dead, and so, soon, are you. Welcome to the Imperial afterlife, where the only exit is 6 feet down, and love is measured in how long you can hold your breath. Let's now crack open the sarcophagus and meet the men who decided that dying wasn't quite traumatic enough. Someone else needed to come with them, preferably many someones, preferably concubines. Because when you're the emperor of all under heaven, your death has to be an ensemble act. Enter Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, a man so powerful he thought immortality was just a diet away. He sent expeditions looking for elixirs. He drank mercury like it was vitamin C, but just in case all that magical nonsense didn't pan out, he made sure he'd be well stocked in the afterlife. What does that mean? Exactly what you fear. Some of Emperor Wu's lower-ranking concubines, women without sons or political use, were selected to rest eternally by his side, which is a delicate royal way of saying they were dispatched, tucked into burial pits, and left to decay among lacquered furniture and gilded despair. There's no polite euphemism here. The women were alive, the tomb was sealed, their breathing, temporary, their role, decorative, their deaths, state-sanctioned performance art for the ghost of an egomaniac. Now let's slide into one of the darkest pits of ancient funerary horror, the tomb of Prince Liu Sheng. He wasn't even an emperor, just a Han Dynasty royal who apparently thought, if Dad can bury people alive, why not me? Excavated in the 1960s, his tomb was filled with not just treasures, but dozens of female skeletons positioned eerily around his jade burial suit. Many were young, some had crushed bones, suggesting forced restraint, some were missing skulls. It's believed these were concubines and servants, ritually sacrificed to give him comfort in the afterlife, or at least silence in death, which he probably never managed in life. It was around this time that a fascinating innovation arrived: death rooms. See, as burial logistics improved and construction grew more elaborate, architects created specially designed underground chambers, not just for the royal body, but for the concubines as well. Think of it as a twisted Airbnb for the eternally doomed. You got your own room. You just didn't get air, water, or options. Some death rooms were inscribed with blessings, charm scripts, and celestial calendars. Others were left bare, just a sealed stone vault where 20, 30, even 60 concubines might be packed like sacrificial sardines. This wasn't subtle. This was intentional. A message to both the living and the dead: the emperor owns you forever. Of course, not all emperors were equally generous. Some were downright frugal with their cruelty. Take Emperor Gaozu, founder of the Han. He ended human sacrifice officially, but you can't stop tradition that easily. Instead, nobles got clever. They renamed it. Instead of killing concubines, it became sending concubines to a company. It was all semantics, baby. One emperor, Emperor Wen, famously refused to allow live burials, claiming it was wasteful and inhumane. A rare breath of sanity? Don't get your hopes up. He simply replaced the women with clay figurines, because symbolic slavery is apparently less problematic than the breathing kind. And then, there were emperors who took things up a notch, not just burying concubines, but forcing them into loyalty oaths before death. Imagine it: a dimly lit room, a scroll, an imperial official, and a young concubine forced to write, "I vow to follow the Son of Heaven into eternity. May my spirit serve him eternally without regret." That oath was then tied to her wrist or burned beside her body. And if she hesitated, she was labeled disloyal, her family dishonored, her remains dumped unceremoniously outside the royal tomb. No dignity in life, no escape in death. This brings us to one of the most absurd tragedies of this entire tradition: the tomb of Lady Guyi. She was a beloved concubine of Emperor Wu. Unlike many, she bore him a son, and unlike many, she didn't die before him. In fact, she lived well past his death, until politics got in the way. Years later, her own son, now Emperor Zhao, ordered her tomb built, but according to court gossip, her spirit refused to rest. Supposedly, she haunted the palace. And what did the court do? They opened her tomb, burned her personal belongings, and sacrificed a servant girl at the entrance to appease her ghost. Because apparently, a murdered teenager is the ancient Chinese version of a sage stick. Even the afterlife had drama. Now, let's take a morbid detour into one of the biggest, boldest royal burials of all time, Ming Dynasty's Yongle Emperor. His tomb, the Changling Mausoleum, was a monument of grandeur, excess, and psychological warfare. Though by the Ming period human sacrifice had mostly ceased, the emperor reportedly still took some loyal servants to the grave with him. While there's no hard record of live burial here, whispers from tomb builders and court journals suggest that some servants entered but never exited. And what about the women? They weren't just killed, sometimes they were poisoned ceremonially, dressed in their finest, seated before an altar, offered a goblet of wine laced with slow-acting toxins. It was all about appearances, because if you looked peaceful, maybe history would forget you screamed. In some cases, concubines were convinced to die. Convinced, as in brainwashed, trained from girlhood to believe that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. It was like a twisted beauty pageant where the winner got a jade bracelet and an oxygen-deprived eternity. They were told they'd be immortalized in legend, that they'd serve in a heavenly court, that their names would live on. Spoiler, they didn't. Most were buried without markers, without names, without stories, all while male historians wrote glowing essays about the piety of women who died for love. You can practically hear the eye roll from across centuries. Now, let's talk about the logistics of being buried alive, because apparently the imperial court had it down to a process. Step 1. Choose your girls, usually the ones without children, ones who couldn't produce political heirs. These women were considered expendable. Some were as young as 15. Step 2. Dress rehearsal. The concubines were washed, perfumed, and dressed in ceremonial robes, usually white or crimson, depending on dynasty. Step 3. Procession. In some cases, they were paraded to the tomb. No crying allowed. Stoicism was part of the aesthetic. Wailing would dishonor the dead emperor. Step 4. The descent. The concubines were led or lowered into the chamber, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs, often with food, talismans, or tokens from the emperor. Step 5. The seal. The stone door or earth plug was closed, slowly, ominously, and finally, the last light extinguished. Step 6. Forgetting. Their names were not recorded. Their stories were not preserved. Their silence was eternal. Let's not forget that many of these women had no say in their destiny from the moment they were selected into the palace. They were taken from families, some sold, some kidnapped, some gifted to the emperor as signs of loyalty from noble households. You could be a girl from a farm, dreaming of rice cakes and a quiet life, and next thing you know, you're being painted and powdered for a life of golden isolation, followed by a tomb with a guy whose greatest achievement was inventing new taxes. In the next part, we'll dissect the psychology of these dynasties, how the imperial cult of masculinity, ownership, and heavenly mandate twisted love into death and romance into ritual murder, and how even after the practice faded, its echoes haunted every woman behind the palace gates. But before we close this chapter, here's a final thought. If love is eternal, does that mean fear is too? Because in these tombs, beneath layers of stone, gold, and jade, lay the bones of women who loved nothing, who were simply chosen, sacrificed, forgotten. And maybe the scariest part of all is that for centuries, this was called honor. Let's now lift the jade lid on the psychology behind this mass historical madness. Because it's not enough to say emperors buried women alive. We must also ask, why was this considered normal, even noble? Answer, because the emperor wasn't just a man, he was a god. At least that's what everyone was forced to believe. He was the son of heaven, the intermediary between mortal soil and divine sky. So when he died, the entire cosmic balance was thought to shift. Nature trembled, stars wept, and apparently so did dozens of concubines, shortly before suffocating in a glorified basement. In this twisted logic, the emperor couldn't just die. He had to ascend, and someone had to help carry his luggage. Not just gold and horses and fake food made of lacquered wood, but people. Real, breathing, blinking people. Let's chew on this delightful cultural nugget. According to Confucian thought, loyalty was everything. And if you were a woman in the palace, Your loyalty was measured by how thoroughly you erased yourself for the emperor's glory. You weren't expected to serve the emperor in life. You were expected to follow him in death, like a ghost intern. Now here's where it gets darker. Some concubines volunteered, or let's say they volunteered. Imagine living in a gilded cage where everything, from your thoughts to your footsteps, is monitored. Then you're told that dying with the emperor will bring your family honor, a stipend, maybe even promotion for your brother. Do you really have a choice? That's not a sacrifice. That's a blackmail with incense. There are reports from the Zhou dynasty, so early in Chinese history it might as well be myth, where young women were trained for death. They were chosen in advance and raised in seclusion, fed sweet poems and patriotic mantras, until they truly believed their destiny was to expire beautifully at the emperor's feet. It's not suicide. It's ritual martyrdom, sanitized through centuries of court poetry. Now fast forward to the Tang dynasty, where culture flourished, art exploded, and concubines were still being disposed of like seasonal decorations. One infamous story involves Emperor Xuanzong, who was obsessed with his consort, Yang Guifei. When she died, not from sacrifice, but assassination during rebellion, legend says dozens of maids and concubines were invited to be buried with her, as tribute, not to her beauty, but to her memory as property. It didn't matter if these women never spoke to Yang. Their death wasn't personal, it was symbolic. They were reminders that women were imperial inventory, and even ghosts needed furniture. So what was it really like in those final moments? Let's look at the logistics again, but this time through the emotional lens. Picture this: a low-ceilinged stone room, oil lamps guttering in corners, 10 to 20 concubines silent, seated on woven mats, dressed in crimson silks, hair combed into ceremonial buns. Some clasp hands, some sob, some simply stare. There is no escape. The doors are closing. The air is already thick with the scent of lacquer and slow-burning incense. Officials chant prayers for a pure passage. The walls echo with silence, and outside, the tomb workers roll the final stone into place. Minutes pass, hours stretch, air thins, and then, just darkness. Final, quiet, cold, and complete. These women didn't die gloriously. They died suffocating, terrified, wondering whether anyone would even remember their names. Most were not given graves of their own. Some were buried upright to stand in service eternally. Others were laid beside the emperor, but not in equality, at his feet like ceremonial rugs. Some records mention poison as a kindness, but make no mistake, this wasn't mercy. This was murder with perfume. And what about their families? You'd think after such honor, they'd be lavish with gifts, land, promotions. And sometimes they were, if the death was graceful. But if a concubine showed even a hint of resistance, her family could be punished for her disloyalty. That's right, you die badly, and your brother loses his job. Now, let's talk about deception. By the late Ming dynasty, emperors knew this practice was getting awkward. So instead of loud executions or mass burials, they simply faked it. Here's how it worked. The emperor dies. A list of women is honored to accompany him. The court announces their loyalty. Their families are rewarded. The women, secretly exiled, locked away in remote palace halls or hidden convents, erased, alive, but politically dead. This was known as a living tomb. You didn't stop breathing, you just stopped existing. It's one of the few merciful evolutions in the history of concubine burial. Because now, instead of literal suffocation, you got lifelong solitary confinement. The emperor still owned you, he just didn't bury the receipt. Meanwhile, imperial historians turned all of this into romantic legend. The official records rarely showed the horror. Instead, they wrote about noble self-sacrifice, unwavering loyalty, and eternal companionship. Let me translate that for you. She died, we lied, you cried, even poetry got in on the action. Poets wrote verses about the graceful descent of women into tombs. They compared their deaths to falling blossoms, which sounds nice until you realize a falling blossom doesn't scream. Here's a real line from a Tang dynasty poem. In death, her rouge remained fresh upon her cheek. The emperor smiles among spirits, and heaven weeps joy. Are you vomiting yet? Let's now talk about the political power of these deaths. Because for all their tragedy, the burial of concubines was never just about death. It was about control. When an emperor died, the empire entered crisis mode. Power shifted, factions fought, and nothing reminded people of imperial authority like watching 20 women die for one man's dignity. It was psychological warfare, aimed at everyone still breathing. A reminder, he was divine. His women died for him. You live for him too, or else. There's a phrase in Chinese imperial ideology: the body dies, but the virtue lives. Except here, virtue means silence, obedience, erasure. And what about the emperors themselves? Did any of them actually love these women? Maybe, possibly, rarely. But the system was bigger than any single emotion. Even if an emperor wept as a concubine was led to her grave, he'd still let it happen, because love was personal, but burial was politics. Love couldn't interrupt ritual. To die beside the emperor meant being frozen in his shadow forever. It meant your story ended where his did, and in some cases, it meant your legacy was rewritten entirely. Like Concubine Wang, a woman of the Qing dynasty rumored to have been buried alive in secret because her presence was required in the afterlife. Her name was wiped from palace records, her face painted over in ancestral scrolls. She only survives today in ghost stories whispered by tomb guards. She became a legend, not for how she lived, but how she vanished. Now, let's rewind and ask a question no historian wants to answer honestly. What if some of these women were pregnant? We don't know for sure, but statistically, it's inevitable. The imperial harem had thousands of women. Many concubines were young and fertile. If even one was pregnant at the time of burial, that means 2 souls went into that tomb, and no one stopped it, because an emperor couldn't risk an illegitimate heir outliving him. Better to bury the potential threat in swaddling cloths before it ever learned to breathe. It's the ultimate horror of this system, not just the erasure of lives, but the prevention of them. Death before birth, silence before voice, and all for the comfort of a corpse in a gold suit. In the next and final part, we'll explore how this monstrous practice finally began to die out, what replaced it, and how echoes of these rituals still haunt modern memory. Spoiler, the ghosts are still there. And so we arrive at the tail end of this horrific parade. The slow, reluctant death of the practice itself. Not because people suddenly woke up and realized, hey, maybe mass murdering women in the name of honor is a bit much, but because regimes crumbled, philosophies shifted, and new flavors of control simply made old ones look inefficient. Let's start with the Ming Dynasty, the late imperial era often romanticized for its porcelain and pagodas. Here, the killing of concubines was still happening, only quieter, less spectacle, more secrecy. Public opinion was beginning to shift, albeit in microscopic increments. Some scholars began to mumble, very carefully, that perhaps burying people alive wasn't strictly Confucian. But don't get too hopeful. In 1644, when the Chongzhen emperor hanged himself as Beijing fell to rebels, he didn't forget protocol. Before stringing himself up, he personally ordered his consorts to die. One committed suicide, another tried and failed, and many were executed by loyal eunuchs. Because even in the face of rebellion, tradition must be served cold and bloody. Then came the Qing dynasty, ruled by the Manchus, outsiders with new hats but the same appetite for absolute control. They tried to soften the optics. Instead of explicitly burying concubines, they embraced the already established practice of shadow burial. Women declared dead, locked in remote temples, silenced for eternity, but technically still breathing. It's like pressing mute on a life instead of delete. By the late 1700s, a strange thing happened. Philosophers and reformers, both Chinese and Western, began trickling into intellectual circles, bringing with them dangerous concepts like individual rights and not being buried alive. And slowly, the imperial court started to feel embarrassed, not because it was cruel, but because it was old-fashioned. Yes, the death of the concubine sacrifice wasn't about ethics, it was about optics. Killing women to honor emperors was beginning to look less like sacred loyalty and more like PR suicide. By the 19th century, as China stumbled through opium wars, famines, and humiliation from foreign powers, the whole notion of burying concubines felt laughably outdated. The empire was collapsing, and no one had time to choreograph poetic deaths. Besides, there were new ways to strip women of autonomy, like foot binding, arranged marriages, forced prostitution, and concubine trafficking. Why kill a woman outright when you could break her slowly? The official abolition of concubine sacrifice didn't come with a bang, but with a whimper. No single law ended it. It just faded, like the perfume of a forgotten corpse. But the echoes remained. Let's jump forward, not just years, but centuries. Because the legacy of these burials didn't vanish, it just mutated. Modern historians digging up tombs, especially royal mausoleums, continue to find shocking signs. Female skeletons without names, hidden chambers packed with bones, grave goods meant only for women, hidden behind emperors' altars, no official records, just evidence without confession. It's like finding a crime scene that everyone swore never happened. Worse still, these women's names were often deliberately erased. The emperor's dogs got tomb inscriptions. The concubines? Nothing. Their deaths were sacred in theory, disposable in practice. And here's the cruel twist of imperial memory. The more these women suffered, the more their suffering was mythologized. They became symbols, not of tragedy, but of virtue. Shrines were built, poems were written. Their torment was recycled into lessons for future women. Be like Lady X, she followed her lord into the tomb. Be like Concubine Y, she drank the poison with a smile. Their pain became propaganda, polished into spiritual wallpaper for a system built on female silence. And in today's pop culture, these stories still bleed into dramas, operas, and novels, not always as horror, but often as romantic sacrifice. We're taught to admire the concubine who died for love, not question the emperor who demanded it. The most popular Chinese historical dramas, full of harem intrigue, palace politics, and poetic death, and buried beneath every scene is a silent corpse, smiling through the script. So what does all this say about human history? That the past isn't just a series of dates and events, it's a museum of nightmares, carefully curated to look beautiful from a distance. But the moment you step closer, you smell the blood beneath the silk. Let's not forget, these concubines were girls. Many entered the palace in their teens. They had no agency, no voice, no exit. Some never even saw the emperor, yet were buried for him. Their entire lives were theater, and their deaths, the final act in someone else's script. And what about the women who resisted, who fought back, who begged to live? They were erased. Their stories were dangerous. Because history only remembers the quiet ones. The ones who complied or died trying. But even silence leaves footprints. In the tomb of Emperor Qin Shi Huang, the same first emperor who built the terracotta army, recent excavations have uncovered the remains of unrecorded women, some buried beside warriors, some alone. No scrolls mention them. No inscriptions name them, but they are there. Reminders that history doesn't just forget, it buries. So let's call it what it was. Not tradition, not devotion, not loyalty, but ritualized femicide, wrapped in incense and embroidered silk. A system where women were born to serve, raised to obey, and sacrificed for silence. And the worst part? For thousands of years, no one flinched. It was just the way things were, like weather or taxes. Now, as we stand in our air-conditioned world of Wi-Fi and rights and hashtags, it's easy to mock the past. But don't get too comfortable, because every age thinks it's enlightened, and every civilization has its own version of the tomb. Maybe ours just has better lighting. So next time you see a painting of a beautiful imperial concubine gazing lovingly at her emperor, remember, she may have been smiling for the artist, but she was probably screaming inside. And now that you know the truth, tell someone, because the least we can do for the dead is not forget how they were killed. Imagine living in a world where your fate, your happiness, your status, your very survival depended not on your family, your education, or even the emperor himself, but on a man who literally had his testicles cut off. Welcome to Imperial China, where eunuchs, those surgically neutered court insiders, held the keys to power, pleasure, and punishment. Yes, in a twisted irony of history, the men who had no manhood decided the destiny of thousands of women. Hey guys, before you get comfortable, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what I do. Drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's dive together into today's journey. In the gilded and grim corridors of the Forbidden City, where golden dragons curled on lacquered walls and the air constantly reeked of incense and paranoia, eunuchs weren't just servants. They were power brokers, whisperers, gatekeepers, and if you were a woman in the emperor's court, especially a concubine, your life hung in the balance of their whims. Let's rewind to the early Han dynasty. At first glance, eunuchs seemed like the perfect solution to a logistical nightmare: how to guard a palace full of women without risking imperial paternity scandals. The logic was brutally simple: cut off the possibility, literally. Remove the parts of the male anatomy that might cause complications, no urges, no heirs. Problem solved. Except what the emperors didn't account for was that removing a man's sexual power didn't remove his ambition. If anything, it turned his focus into a laser beam of calculated vengeance, scheming, and survival. These men were mutilated young, sometimes as children, sold or gifted by desperate families. And once inside the palace, they had two choices: climb the silken ladder of court politics or be trampled underfoot like incense ash. Eunuchs became masters of manipulation. Because they had no family of their own, they poured everything into palace intrigue. They were invisible and everywhere. They knew who whispered in whose ear, who slipped through which doorway at midnight, and, most critically, who was favored by the emperor. Now, imagine being a concubine in this serpentine world. You're plucked from your home, possibly in your early teens, dolled up like a living doll, and delivered into a harem of hundreds, sometimes thousands, of other women all vying for one man's attention. But the emperor isn't even your first obstacle. First, you have to get past the eunuchs. Want to get close to the emperor? You'll need a eunuch to recommend you. Want better food, a nicer room, access to the gardens? Eunuch. Want to avoid being accused of witchcraft or disloyalty? Eunuch. They managed your appointments, your punishments, and often your reputation. If you got on the bad side of one of these silk-robed power holders, good luck. One whisper in the wrong ear, and you could be exiled to a cold storage closet until you die of fever. One particularly grotesque example: during the Tang dynasty, there was a eunuch named Gao Lishi who practically acted as co-ruler with Emperor Xuanzong. Gao didn't just hold court influence, he decided which concubines were worthy of the emperor's time. If he didn't like a woman, she vanished from rotation. If he favored her, her status soared like a kite, and every smile, gift, or glance had to be paid back, sometimes with favors, sometimes with blood. And speaking of blood, let's talk about selection ceremonies. When new women were brought into the imperial harem, they were inspected like livestock. Teeth, skin, posture, virginity, all were noted in meticulous records by palace officials and eunuchs. But beyond the formalities, it was often a eunuch's quiet nod that meant everything. If a woman carried herself with too much pride, she might be passed over. Too meek, forgettable. The eunuchs had become curators of the emperor's desire, and they wielded that power with theatrical cruelty. Why so bitter, you ask? Because eunuchs lived in a bizarre limbo. They were inside the palace, but not part of the royal family. They were powerful, but despised, trusted, yet ridiculed. They were mocked in public and feared in private, and most knew they would die without a family name, without children, without legacy. So what did they do? They built kingdoms of influence, and women were the building blocks. In the Ming dynasty, things got even darker. The harem system had evolved into a brutal hierarchy, with some concubines treated like queens and others more like glorified prisoners. Who decided which path a woman took? Often, the eunuchs. The infamous Wei Zhongxian, a eunuch who effectively ruled the empire during the reign of the young Tianqi emperor, had entire factions of women exiled or promoted based solely on whether they praised him or crossed him. Some even suspect that eunuchs orchestrated murders of concubines who became too powerful. When Lady Wang, a favorite of the emperor, allegedly threatened to become empress and disrupt Wei Zhongxian's control, she mysteriously fell ill and died. Her maids were executed, her body burned, and the case closed without investigation. The irony? Women were trapped in the harem to serve one man, but that man, the emperor, was rarely accessible. The people they had to please, flatter, and sometimes bribe were eunuchs, the gatekeepers of survival, the twisted puppeteers of imperial femininity. Even the rules of childbirth, one of the few routes a concubine had to rise in power, were mediated by eunuchs. If a concubine became pregnant, her protection was not guaranteed. She had to immediately inform a eunuch, who would then notify higher court officials. And if the eunuchs didn't want her to rise in status, perhaps because she was aligned with the wrong faction, that pregnancy could mysteriously disappear. Death by miscarriage, or more often, quiet poison. No one asked questions, because to question a eunuch with imperial favor was to invite ruin. But let's not paint all eunuchs with a single sinister brush. Some did genuinely protect women. Some acted as go-betweens, carried letters, passed secret poems, and helped concubines escape cruel punishments. But that help always came at a cost, and that cost was loyalty to the eunuch, not the emperor. The Forbidden City was a pressure cooker, a maze of silks and secrets where survival depended on alliances. And if you were a woman, your most important alliance wasn't with your sisters. It was with the man who had no family, no future, and a deep, smoldering thirst for power. And remember, the emperor might only visit you once in your life, but the eunuch, he watched you every day. So yes, eunuchs, those paradoxical creatures created by a society that feared women's influence almost as much as it feared male desire, held the keys to life and death, not because they were born to power, but because they were mutilated into it. That's part 1. When you're ready, I'll continue with part 2, where we go deeper into the ranks of eunuchs, expose the internal betrayals, and meet the women who dared to challenge them, and what happened next. Let's peel back another embroidered silk curtain and dive deeper into the labyrinth of power, betrayal, and high-stakes survival that was the Imperial Chinese court, where the eunuchs didn't just decide a woman's status, they dictated entire chapters of dynastic history. Part 2 begins where it always gets messier, when people with nothing to lose become the ones who write the rules. By the time we enter the late Ming dynasty, the harem had ballooned into a micro-empire of its own. Tens of thousands of women spread across vast palatial wings, meticulously sorted by rank, region, and fertility status. Sounds organized, right? Well, not if you remember that it was governed by a barely controlled fraternity of eunuchs, some of whom rose to wield more power than the emperors themselves. One such figure was Wei Zhongxian, the infamous puppet master whose rise was so explosive it's still the stuff of historical nightmares. Born a peasant, castrated at a young age for reasons lost to time, but likely economic desperation, Wei clawed his way into palace life through every survival skill imaginable. Manipulation, flattery, calculated cruelty. When he aligned himself with the wet nurse of the future Tianqi emperor, everything changed. Suddenly, Wei had direct access to the most powerful boy in the empire. And from that moment on, no concubine advanced without his blessing. Wei created a labyrinthine system of eunuch informants, each stationed throughout the palace like human surveillance cameras. Women who wanted access to the emperor had to pay, sometimes in silver, sometimes in gossip, and often in loyalty. Refuse? You might wake up with your name struck from the records, your meals poisoned, or your chambers mysteriously set on fire. This was not just tyranny, it was a system, and eunuchs like Wei were its architects, and the women? Trapped like exotic birds in a golden cage, they learned to adapt. Some became masters of subtle resistance. One concubine, known only by the poetic name Jade Willow, supposedly wrote coded messages in her embroidery, smuggling out reports of corruption with each stitch, but her network was uncovered, and she was quietly reassigned to the cold palace, a freezing, lightless wing where disfavored women were sent to rot. Others played the game with ruthless elegance. They befriended eunuchs, gifted them luxuries, flattered their egos, and whispered secrets into their ears. A concubine who could seduce a eunuch's loyalty could effectively bypass the emperor. She might get better quarters, medicine, or even an invitation to the rare and coveted evening selection. What was the evening selection, you ask? Oh, just the imperial version of Tinder, only with higher stakes and worse lighting. On certain nights, the emperor would choose a concubine to spend the night with him, but he didn't personally go looking. No, that job fell to the eunuchs. The selection wasn't romantic, it was strategic, cold, and awkward. Eunuchs paraded women in front of the emperor like livestock. Some say they carried scrolls listing each woman's age, background, and last menstrual cycle, because fertility was everything. The eunuchs decided who got to be on that scroll, who got to bathe beforehand, who got makeup, and who had to wait in a dark corridor, wearing nothing but a paper-thin robe. It wasn't love. It was a power lottery, and eunuchs held the tickets. The harem, though gilded, was far from safe. Internal rivalries flourished like mold on silk. Women formed alliances, flower gangs, as they were sometimes mockingly called, led by powerful concubines who acted like queens, backed by their loyal eunuch supporters. These gangs warred for resources, gossip, and influence, and when things turned sour, the consequences could be catastrophic. One concubine allegedly tried to poison a rival by slipping powdered lead into her tea. The crime was discovered, but instead of reporting it, the eunuchs used it as leverage. They blackmailed both women into service, controlling them with the threat of exposure. This was standard practice. Information was currency, and eunuchs were the bankers. And the emperor? Often he was oblivious, or simply indifferent. Some emperors, like the Wanli emperor, became so disillusioned with court politics that they retreated entirely, refusing to meet ministers, ignoring petitions, and vanishing into personal pleasure palaces. That left eunuchs in full control, not just of court rituals, but of who was allowed to bear the imperial bloodline. One terrifying result of this unchecked power was the manipulation of paternity. Rumors swirled for centuries that some eunuchs, seeking to tighten their grip, selected which concubines became pregnant, possibly even arranging trysts with secret lovers to produce heirs when the emperor was too ill or disinterested. These rumors are impossible to confirm, but the mere existence of them shows the level of suspicion and chaos that clouded palace life. Eunuchs became enforcers of impossible standards. A woman's fate could turn on something as minor as an accidental glance, a misunderstood phrase, or being in the wrong courtyard at the wrong time. Surveillance was constant, even her dreams were not her own. Some eunuchs reportedly interrogated concubines over who they dreamed about, interpreting it as a sign of loyalty or betrayal. This all sounds unthinkable, but the imperial system demanded control. Women were both treasured and disposable, sacred yet replaceable, and the eunuchs, who themselves were trapped in a grotesque half-life, enforced that contradiction with terrifying efficiency. The final horror? Even in death, the eunuchs still had power. When an emperor died, the concubines who had not borne him children were sometimes forced to follow him into the afterlife, not in poetry or song, but through ritual suicide. And who managed that grim process? The eunuchs. They prepared the bodies, sealed the tombs, and, according to some records, ensured that no concubine dared resist her honorable fate. In essence, eunuchs became grim reapers of court femininity. They ushered women into power, and they ushered them out of life. So next time someone tells you history is boring, remind them. There was a time when a castrated man decided who a woman loved, feared, birthed, and died for. That's the end of part 2. Ready for part 3? In the next chapter, we'll explore the most shocking betrayals in eunuch history, the women who dared to fight back, and how the entire system began to unravel under the weight of its own cruelty. Here's part 3 of why eunuchs decided a woman's fate in Imperial China. Descending deeper into the gilded nightmare, where rebellion simmered, masks slipped, and the tiniest act of defiance could become a political earthquake. This is the part where the cracks begin to show. By the 15th century, the imperial court had become a paradox, dazzlingly opulent on the outside, rotten with suspicion on the inside. The forbidden city glittered with gold, jade, and intricate mosaics, but behind its walls, paranoia fermented like spoiled wine. Eunuchs wielded more influence than ever, and not everyone was willing to play nice anymore. Enter the age of concubine counterattacks. Yes, for centuries, concubines had been silenced, shuffled, and surveilled. But every system of oppression eventually underestimates its victims. These women weren't just passive beauties in painted silks. Some were cunning, educated, even strategically lethal. And they started to understand one essential truth. If you can't beat the eunuchs in brute power, beat them in information warfare. Some of the boldest women in the harem began keeping ledgers, not of embroidery patterns or tea blends, but of gossip. Who favored whom, who paid which eunuch, who secretly plotted against which consort. These handwritten arsenals became bargaining chips in the deadly game of survival. One famous case involved consort An, a low-ranking beauty from a minor family who managed to climb the ranks not through her looks, but through espionage. She allegedly posed as a confidant to the eunuch supervisor of her wing, all while secretly documenting every corrupt exchange. Every midnight tryst, every act of violence swept under the silk rugs. When she finally handed over her ledger to an ambitious court official, it triggered a scandal that rocked the inner court. Eunuchs were executed, servants disappeared, and consort An. She didn't just survive, she became first consort. But it came at a price. Her entire family was poisoned within weeks. Whether by the eunuchs or by jealous rivals, no one could prove. It's stories like this that illustrate a brutal reality. Power in the palace was never clean. It came dipped in the blood and perfume, and for every woman who rose through guile, 10 more were crushed under the gears of the eunuch machine. This led to a particularly disturbing development, the rise of ghost concubines. These weren't spirits, though they might as well have been. They were living women, stripped of titles and privileges, forbidden from speaking or appearing in public. Some had been framed by eunuchs. Others had committed the ultimate sin of rejecting one. Their punishment? Erasure. They remained in the palace, confined to invisible wings. No visitors, no attendants. Food slipped through small doors. They existed as a warning. The eunuchs giveth and the eunuchs taketh away. Meanwhile, outside the court, rumors festered. Ordinary citizens began whispering about the unnatural power eunuchs held. Pamphlets, graffiti, and underground poems mocked them, portraying them as twisted manipulators. The phrase, half a man, twice the devil, became a common slur. But within the court, emperors still leaned on eunuchs like crutches. Why? Because they were effective. A eunuch didn't threaten the royal bloodline. He didn't father rebellious sons. He had no family loyalties. He was the perfect tool of absolute monarchy, except of course when the tool picked up the chisel and began sculpting the kingdom himself. Some emperors figured this out the hard way. Take the case of Emperor Yingzong of the Ming dynasty. Captured by Mongols in a disastrous military campaign, he was replaced by his brother on the throne. But guess who engineered his return years later, like a palace-themed episode of Game of Thrones? That's right, the eunuchs. Led by the infamous Cao Jixiang, a cadre of high-ranking eunuchs staged what was essentially a court coup. They forced the brother emperor to abdicate, reinstated Yingzong, and purged the officials who had dared to sideline their precious emperor. It wasn't love, it was leverage, because once Yingzong returned, he owed them everything. This pattern repeated over and over, eunuchs choosing who got to lead, and concubines clawing for visibility within their shadow. The emperor might have been the sun, but the eunuchs controlled the mirrors that directed the light. And if a woman wanted to bask in that light, she had to outmaneuver men who had sacrificed everything, including their own bodies, to maintain their place. And here's where the real psychological horror sets in. Eunuchs weren't merely villains in some black and white morality play. They were victims, too, of mutilation, of abandonment, of desperation. Many were castrated as children by families hoping to win favor at court. Their identities were erased, their futures decided before puberty, but instead of succumbing to despair, they turned their pain into purpose. If they couldn't be men, they'd be power. And in doing so, they shaped the destiny of every concubine who dared to dream beyond the silken cage. So what happens when a class of mutilated men hold dominion over a class of silenced women? You get a palace where every glance is coded, every sentence double-edged, and every dream has a cost. It was a psychological jungle wrapped in gold thread. A high-stakes masquerade ball where one wrong move didn't get you uninvited, it got you buried. By now, you're probably thinking, how did it ever end? Well, spoiler alert, not quietly. In part 4, we'll watch the entire system begin to devour itself. The eunuchs grow too bold, the concubines take fatal chances, and history, as always, finds a bloody way to reset the board. Buckle up, because the final act is where the nightmare ends. But not before taking a few more bodies with it. Here is part 4 of why eunuchs decided a woman's fate in Imperial China. The final descent into the collapse of the velvet-wrapped nightmare. By the late stages of Imperial China's dynastic rule, the eunuchs had become too powerful, too brazen, and perhaps most fatally, too visible. Their influence had gone from whispers in the shadows to blaring trumpets in the throne room. They appointed emperors, crushed dissent, and even ran entire provinces through puppets. But history, as we know, does not tolerate unchecked power forever. And in the end, the eunuchs were not simply overthrown. They were obliterated in fits of righteous fury, blood, and bureaucratic overcorrection. But before their fall, the palace reached peak absurdity. Emperors began disappearing into their inner chambers for weeks, speaking only through eunuch intermediaries. Some rulers were so isolated that officials weren't even sure if the emperor they were serving was still alive or had been replaced by a conveniently silent double. Yes, that was an actual rumor. And yes, people were executed for daring to voice it. Meanwhile, the concubines, those delicate ornaments once paraded like trophies, had morphed into political operatives. It was no longer about beauty or lineage, it was about alliances. A single whispered comment to the right eunuch could elevate you from forgotten consort to queen of the inner court. But the price for playing the game wrong? Horrifying. Concubines suspected of betrayal or disloyalty could face punishments that sound like something out of a sadist's handbook: tongue removal, forced starvation, public shaming rituals where the concubine was paraded through the inner court, while eunuchs hurled accusations and the rest of the harem watched in silence, knowing full well it could be them next. The palace wasn't just a hive of politics. It was an arena of cruelty, masked with silk and etiquette. One particularly grotesque incident involved a concubine who was accused of trying to poison a rival. Eunuchs demanded she confess. She refused, so they locked her in a pitch-black room with the decaying bodies of 2 dead servants as punishment. When she was finally released weeks later, she was blind. The eunuchs deemed her unfit for beauty and reassigned her to toilet cleaning duty inside the Forbidden City. Eventually, even the emperors began to fear what they had created. Late Ming and early Qing rulers started executing or exiling eunuchs in waves. Anti-eunuch purges became a kind of imperial detox, meant to reset the balance of power. Sometimes these purges were based on actual conspiracies. Other times, they were just power plays in the never-ending chess match of dynasty survival. But no purge was quite as cataclysmic as the one under the Qing Emperor Yongzheng. Yongzheng came to power suspicious of everyone, but especially eunuchs. He believed they had corrupted his predecessors, manipulated the throne, and made a mockery of imperial dignity. So he did what any reform-minded, absolute monarch with a grudge would do. He gutted the system, literally. He banned eunuchs from holding government positions, shut down their secret police networks, executed high-ranking eunuchs, and sent others to remote provinces where they died of mysterious causes. The power structure collapsed almost overnight. The intricate web of surveillance, manipulation, and gatekeeping simply vanished. And for a moment, it looked like the nightmare was over. But here's the kicker. Even without the eunuchs, the system still found new ways to torment the women of the court. Concubines were still chosen like livestock, still judged on obedience and fertility, still imprisoned within a system of hierarchy so rigid that even the death of their emperor didn't release them. It just changed who held the keys to the prison. Because here's the twist. The fall of the eunuchs didn't liberate the concubines. In many ways, it made their lives more precarious. Without the eunuchs as middlemen, concubines had to deal directly with palace officials and extended royal relatives, men who had no vested interest in keeping them alive after their usefulness expired. In some cases, newly widowed concubines were forced into Buddhist nunneries against their will. Others were quietly retired to countryside estates where they were forbidden from speaking about the court. And in the worst cases, they simply vanished. No records, no names, no tombs. By the time the Qing dynasty crumbled in the early 20th century, the eunuch system had become a footnote, a cultural oddity people whispered about but no longer feared. The last imperial eunuch, Sun Yaoting, died in 1996. He had served the final emperor, Puyi, yes, the one from the Last Emperor movie, and lived long enough to see his story turned into historical kitsch. But the legacy of eunuch rule is not something that should be laughed off. Because when we talk about eunuchs, we're not just talking about the strange mechanics of ancient bureaucracy. We're talking about an entire gendered class who were mutilated, enslaved, and then weaponized by a monarchy to dominate another class of enslaved women. We're talking about a system so deeply twisted that mutilation became a career move. Silence was considered loyalty, and survival meant outwitting both the people who ruled you and the ones who served them. And we're talking about the concubines, their dreams, their fears, and their whispered prayers in the quiet dark, forever locked in a golden cage built by trauma and tradition. Their fates decided by the eunuchs who held the keys. So, the next time someone romanticizes ancient courts or fantasizes about life in a palace, Remember this. Beneath the brocade robes and incense smoke was a world where a woman's life could turn on the whim of a man who'd been forced to give up his own. And history has a long, cruel memory. Thanks for staying until the bitter end. If your spine is tingling, that means you're still alive. And in ancient China, that alone would have been a miracle.